Some years ago, I went to a lecture by Wole Soyinka at the Guggenheim in New York, and the man introducing him said, Wole Soyinka needs no introduction, which is exactly the sort of person that you do want to introduce, the person who needs no introduction. Amit Chaudhuri is one of those people as well, who needs no introduction, especially for this audience, but I'm going to do it anyway. We've been keeping him busy since he arrived at Smith with a concert on Saturday night, class visits today. And now this lecture, Invisibility and Freedom, 2 stories by Premchand, and the trajectory of modernity. Which I have to say sounds more like a talk by a literature professor than it does by one of today's most distinguished novelists. But then Amit Chaudhuri is both, and also a notable singer, composer, and recording artist. He was born in Kolkata and grew up in Mumbai, and in his recent memoir, Finding the Raga, he writes that he skipped as much school as possible in order to read on his own, and then to work with a series of gurus, professional musicians with whom, in his teens, he began serious vocal training. At first, he wanted to be a singer-songwriter in what he called the Canadian idiom, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen. But he found his principal musical home in the North Indian classical tradition, in which his mother also sang. He left India for undergraduate education at University College London, and afterwards did a PhD at Oxford with a dissertation on D.H. Lawrence's poetry. And then in 1991, before he was 30, he published his first novel, A Strange and Sublime Address. His first novel, and the first of many prize winners as well. Other books soon followed, more now than one can count. Fiction, essays, poetry. Most recently, Sojourn, a short, elliptical, and entirely brilliant novel about a writer's disorienting experience in Berlin. That most disorienting and maybe most exhilarating of European capitals. Among other things, he's written the libretto for an opera by Ravi Shankar, and recorded music of his own as well. For many years in the new millennium, he taught at the University of East Anglia, Britain's leading creative writing program. Since 2020, he's been based at Ashoka University outside of Delhi. So much for the CV part of this introduction. What distinguishes Amit Chaudhuri's fiction is his resistance to easy ideas of what an Indian novel in English ought to be like. When he began to publish, the standard idea of such a novel, in the West especially, is that of a big, sprawling book for a big, sprawling country. Midnight's Children, A Suitable Boy, books with which what he's described as lofty themes and causes. His own work resists that. His novels are short, spare, delicate, restrained. J. Garfield just described Sojourn to me as desiccated in an entirely interesting and positive way. They're quiet. Books with a space for reverie, for daydreams, for finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. In Finding the Raga, he puts it like this, describing his need for a narrative not to be a story, but a series of opening paragraphs where life hasn't already happened, ready for recounting, but is about to happen, or is happening, and as a result, can't be domesticated into a perfect retelling. Narrative, he adds, should be an unfolding rather than a representation. We, whether we're listeners or performers, we don't know it as a piece to be performed, we listen to it as it happens. Listening takes us out of the control of authorship or ownership. It involves an openness to contingency. Close quotes. The moment unfolds, and as it does, that moment has its fullness, one that doesn't need to be subordinated to a whole. Fiction in Chaudhuri's hands comes to seem like a raga, perhaps. Or perhaps, because I did think of her as I read, the raga in his account recalls the art of Virginia Woolf. I don't know if you'd agree with that. Maybe later today I'll find out. One of his most important essays is called Against Fusion, against the postmodern mashup of different cultures. What he wants instead is a conversation between cultures, a dialectic, even an argument in which one culture shapes and changes another, and is changed in turn. Which leads us to his talk today, one that links Premchand, the early 20th century Hindi writer, who's usually held to have created the possibility of realistic fiction in that language. It links Premchand and modernism, so often held to be a European import. Though not, crucially, in Bengal, where Chaudhuri was born, the land of Tagore and also Satyajit Ray, and where modernism has had a distinctive form of its own. In founding the Raga, Chaudhuri writes that when he was growing up in the 1970s, young people of his class and of English language education found the literatures of what were called India's vernacular languages. They found them discomforting, quasi-religious in a way that was at odds with the modernity they cultivated. We felt Indian, he writes, but also somehow felt Woodstock was our inheritance. I think very few South Asian writers in English, very few from his own generation at least, would feel comfortable giving a scholarly lecture on Hindi fiction. Chaudhuri does. And if younger writers, younger singers, see the possibility of an art beyond fusion, it will be in part because of his example. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your beautiful and generous introduction, Michael, and illuminating, even for me. I mean, seriously. Thank you for that. I have a lecture in front of me. I've written it out, but if I read out the whole thing, it take me 1.5 hours. So I've kind of made desperate sort of notes and tick marks and things to kind of tell myself what I should read out and what I should paraphrase. So it's going to be that, but it's an intimate audience and many friends here, so I'm sure you will sort of indulge me as I kind of make my way through this stuff. The first part I do want to read out, I guess I want to talk about freedom. I want to talk about invisibility, that the kind of cultures and lineages we don't see, and I want to talk about the emergence of kinds of modernity in India. So let me just start without further delay. There's a sense today that Indian writing in the Indian languages has become largely invisible. This is true not only of the Indian languages, though it's true of all languages, including European ones, except English. What's become invisible or inaudible are not just the delineations, the voices of different forms of authenticity. It's the modernist avant-garde argumentations that say Urdu fiction or Bengali or German poetry are, in their different ways, embodiments of. We no longer have a living sense of the forms of thinking that French, Bengali, or Kannada writing comprise. Translation or the availability of a German or Tamil novelist in the English language sphere has, with globalization, tended to become a form of gentrification. To read Proust now is to participate in the gentrifying process as much as visiting a particular neighborhood or drinking a particular kind of coffee is. Translation seldom any longer opens anything up. I think of invisibility as one of the manifestations of freedom, but to do this I have to refer to the history of the invisibility of a great deal of literary and modernist practice, including practices in India. I have to distinguish the invisibility I'm invoking from invisibility in the time of free market globalization, which is not so much a different form of existence as the equivalent of non-existence. That is, invisibility is not a different form of existence in the time of globalization. It is the equivalent of non-existence. Today, to be visible is to exist. In the early 1900s, a paradox was available to the artists. They could, in some way, begin to exist through invisibility. This paradox is unavailable to us now. So I'm not comparing the invisibility or non-existence conferred by globalization on, say, non-Anglophone literatures with the domain of invisibility as a place of play and creativity in the time of modernity. The time of modernity is, of course, also the time of colonialism and empire, the time of the occupation of one country by another. The response to occupation is resistance, certainly, but another response borne out by examining our literary and artistic works from the 19th century onwards is play. The fact that this might be a possibility is put forward by Jean-Paul Sartre in relation to life in Nazi-occupied Paris in a short essay he wrote for The Atlantic towards the end of the war in 1944. The terms he uses are freedom as well as resistance. Yet there's something about his provocative use of the first word that asks us to think of freedom not simply as a goal you achieve through resistance, but to imagine it in its implicit interchangeability with play as a form of resistance itself. Never were we freer than under the German occupation, he says. And I continue to quote from him. We had lost all our rights, and first of all, our right to speak. They insulted us to our faces every day, and we had to hold our tongues. They deported us en masse as workers, as Jews, as political prisoners. Everywhere, upon the walls, in the press, on the screen, we found that filthy and insipid image of ourselves which the oppressor wished to present to us. And because of all of this, we were free. I'm not setting up a literal correspondence here between Nazi occupation and colonial rule in India. I'm drawing attention to Sartre's portrayal of the vanquished who are immediately recognizable to their oppressors for being what they are, and also to the transition that, in Sartre's account, the vanquished make towards invisibility, in this case their invisibility as human beings, that grants them this curious freedom, as stepping outside of the oppressors and even one's own parameters of thought in a way that might only be called, in spite of the dreadful circumstances of the occupation, playful. There are many sentences in Sartre's short essay I return to. For instance, the more the Nazi venom crept into our thoughts, the more each precise thought became a conquest. I like this idea that precision involves the conquest of a force that intends to master us, whether that force comes to us from outside us or within. It recognizes that mastery depends on generalization and abstraction. I also respond to the notion that precision is a hidden, I won't use the word inward, response to generalization. Secrecy gives each precise thought not only strength, but since it's hidden, playfulness. Play and the quest for precision converge when faced with the oppressor. And given that precision is a characteristic of modernism, one might say that Sartre's statement gives a hint here, perhaps an inadvertent one, that the modern is a domain of freedom. Quote, "The secret of man," says Sartre, "is in his power to resist suffering to the point of death." End quote. If it's secret, then it is for the most part, like the imagination, unexhibited. Again, Sartre creates an unlooked for, maybe an inappropriate connection with play. Quote, "And that is why the resistance was a true democracy. For the soldier, as for his superior, the same danger, the same loneliness, the same responsibility, the same absolute freedom within the discipline." End quote. Sartre is speaking in terms of musical improvisation. Quote, "the same absolute freedom within the discipline." One recalls then Roquentin's continual crises in Sartre's 1938 novel Nausea. Crises only resolved momentarily and slightly unconvincingly by the experience of listening to a jazz record in a cafe. The voice of the negress, the narrator's word, suggesting that it's possible to be washed clean of the sin of existing. The fact that it's jazz and a black person singing is prescient of the notion that that a person at once visible and invisible might also be free. But it would take the war for Sartre to translate himself from being Roquentin, the anguished listener, to the potential of being the negress. In his essay in The Atlantic, Sartre elaborates on the possessors of the secret, that is, on all who practice, quote, the same absolute freedom within the discipline. Quote, thus in Blood and Shadows, he says, a republic erected itself, the strongest of republics. Each of its citizens knew what he owed to every other, and that each could count on that alone. Each of them understood in the completest loneliness his historic role and responsibility. Each of them set themselves freely against the oppressors. And in his freedom, in choosing himself, he chose the freedom of all. This republic without institutions, army, or police made every Frenchman affirm and maintain it against Nazism at every moment. End quote. As with Sartre's use of the word free, the word citizens too is curious and in its way liberating. What kind of citizenry can the defeated comprise? Sartre is, among other things, setting up a renovating, ironic correspondence with a dead idea, the Republic of Letters, except that Sartre's Republic has no figureheads and is unconstrained by contradictions between secrecy and community, private and public. It is powerful in its lack of power, its absence of, quote, institutions, army, or police. It's a play republic with play citizens, and simultaneously it's a republic of play. I'll return to Sartre's observations later in my attempt to plot a course for modernity and modernism. I don't say Indian modernity or Indian modernism because I'm not persuaded by these categories. Variants of modernism based on identity or nationality still assume the existence of a modernism whose identity is unspoken. It's this identity that continues to exert a hold upon us and refuses to open the category up. I'm going to expand on my sense not of other modernities and modernisms, but of modernity and modernism themselves, seeking entry points into them different from the ones that were handed down to me. Modernity and modernism aren't interchangeable, of course, but I do see a relationship between them. My understanding of modernity distances itself from interpretations where the term denotes positively or negatively progress and development. Modernity is, for me, a peculiar intermediary period that made it possible to celebrate the non-monumental and the incomplete. Between this particular modernity and modernism, there's a continuity. Modernism comprises a critique of the Enlightenment idea of progress, which a particular sense of the word modern depends on so centrally. It arrives at its critique not by positing a golden age from the past against the present, but by holding up the significance of the incomplete, the slow, and the non-representational. Modernism, then, is a contemplative rather than a nostalgic turn. I wish to look primarily at two meanings latent in modern and its competing conjugations, modernize and modernist. The first to do with development and the second with the incomplete. My aim is to explore them in the context of India. I recall eavesdropping on a recent online talk by Dipesh Chakraborty on the emergence of modernity in Bengal, which included a fascinating account of the scholar Shibnath Shastri's correspondence in the late 19th century on the matter of his relationship with and belief in God. Shastri was born in 1847 and died in 1919. In the delineation of this relationship, Chakraborty could see Shibnath Shastri's presence as a modern becoming clearer. That is, a growing inwardness characterized Shastri's assessment of the relationship with God, and with inwardness came the marks of individualism. One might hazard a guess that historians, Indian historians included, make the history of the modern concomitant with the history of individualism. The arrival of modernity coincides with the arrival of the individual. The emergence of individuality is, of course, viewed as a development, an irrevocable movement forward, whatever the losses of being an individual might entail. The Shibnath Shastri moment is in a sense, a rehearsal of the leap Christopher Bailey says Ram Mohan Roy made in the late 18th century. Can you hear me at the back? Oh, okay. In the late 18th century, from being an administrative assistant and scholar to becoming India's first liberal. That leap, too, was accompanied by the establishment of the idea of one God and the possibility of having a relationship with Him. Roy, we are told by all accounts, including the ones taught in school, recovers Hinduism's God through the Upanishads. The Upanishadic turn is portrayed as a turn towards monotheism. This is still more or less taken as a given. The creation of the Brahmo Samaj in 1828 by Ram Mohan Roy stands for the formalization of this position, the founding of a reformist worldview that frees itself from polytheism through the rearticulation of an ancient native lineage of monotheism. Why is the turn towards monotheism crucial in the history of modernity? Does its importance have to do with proving to the colonizers that Indians had a counterpart to the European Protestant and Unitarian traditions? Partly it was related to the fact that monotheism was seen as an improvement over polytheism and its cacophony. Of course, the notion of monotheism being the correct religious alternative goes back to Christianity and Islam and their disdain for idol worship. But Islam and Hinduism coexisted in India without this question of gods versus God ever becoming anything other than a continual, if deep, rift in a worldview, in worldview, a rift on whose either side one could set up house. It's only with Ram Mohan that monotheism takes on a new resonance, points to the coming into existence of a new class of Indians, and becomes a founding moment in the history of the liberal. The turn to monotheism is all important to this narrative of modernity because the existence of one God increasingly implies the existence of the individual for whom God is meaningful. By contrast, it's assumed that the array of deities that comprise polytheism are hosted and supplicated to by a community. God, on the other hand, as we see with Shibnath Shastri, himself a leading Brahmo half a century after Ram Mohan, is a private matter. In this formation of the individual in the trajectory of Indian liberalism, the Cartesian formulation is rewritten as, I think of God, therefore I am. You can't think of gods, you can only live with them. The polytheistic world is too undifferentiated from ourselves. In the prehistory of the founding of the Brahmo Samaj and the inauguration of a liberal ethos, we must place the publication of the English translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Charles Wilkins in 1785, particularly because it catches Warren Hastings' attention as a Unitarian text. Here possibly begins the myth of Indian monotheism as well as part of the catalyzing process leading to the advent of the individual and then of the liberal. Unitarianism disagrees with the idea, and I don't want to describe what Unitarianism is, I don't have time. But there is a kind of understanding Unitarianism as a form of, within Christianity, as a form of rationalism, as a rejection of the numinous, as a rejection of the miraculous birth. So already we are moving towards a kind of individualism, individuality, and for Warren Hastings to say it is a Unitarian text of the Gita is an important part of the movement contained in this history that leads to then Roy and the centrality we give him and his so-called the so-called monotheism he's recovering from the Gita and Upanishads. So these texts, the Gita and Upanishads, are still to be found today in the location once created for them by Indology and Oriental studies as forms of scripture or religious teaching or receptacles of the wisdom of the East. Yet even Indologists would have sense and etc. etc. I'm saying that even Indologists like Raymond Schwab, when they say that the discovery of the Upanishads leads to a correction of the old idea of humanism as not extending beyond the Mediterranean basin. He does use the word, the history of humanism. It's odd, but he doesn't say, we learned now more about other religions and religions of the East. He said that we have to correct our history of humanism and our earlier mapping of it as only extending up to the Mediterranean basin has to be corrected. So there is a sense going on that these are not, they are not completely, as was understood till then, religious resources. They're resources for the human, or the humanistic, or the individual. Some sort of, some sort of attempt is being made to understand what's going on there, and one attempt comes from, of course, putting it in the kind of Unitarian definition, but then other developments will take place. Are the Upanishads monotheistic? I don't think so. And I say these things purely as a writer who has a particular kind of interest in these texts, coming from where I do. I'm not as a scholar. Are the Upanishads monotheistic? I don't think so. Both the Upanishads and the Gita formulate radical, non-binary interventions, as does Buddhism. They are among the earliest and still most compelling forms of non-binary critical thinking. They involve experiments with thought that lie outside the mainstream in our culture. Nor do they adhere to the Judeo-Christian binary of an overseeing God in control of creation, a powerful, omniscient, omnipresent being that man looks up to. The notion of Brahman, which means neither Brahmin nor the god Brahma, though he's sometimes confused with Brahma, is a non-binary concept rather than a monotheistic God. This means, unlike God, Brahman is neither one thing nor another. Quote, he is near and he is far. And Brahman is, unlike God, both present and absent. Quote, what the eye cannot see, but whereby the eye can see. What the tongue cannot taste, but whereby the tongue can taste. This is not God, but a conceptual challenge. Rasa theorists like Bhattanayak and Abhinavagupta in the 9th and 10th century respectively suggest that it is possible to taste Brahman not with the tongue but through rasa, which is aesthetic emotion or taste. Quote from Bhattanayak, the taste of rasa is akin to the savoring of Brahman. End quote. This comment from Bhattanayak is a reminder that Brahman can be savored through the release from conceptual parameters that rasa involves, so that an experience that doesn't entail direct physical contact, watching a play, accessing Brahman, becomes a physical one, savoring or asvada. Brahman then is at odds with the way we conceive of God and our relationship with him. The Upanishads as a resource for monotheism is a misreading necessary for the starting point of liberalism in India. The monotheistic temper becomes fundamental to the progressive ethos of the Indian liberal. The casting off of the entanglements of the polytheistic universe, its irrational beliefs, not so much miracles where Hinduism is concerned, but rituals and superstitions, leading to a vanguard, such as Ram Mohan is an early example of, responding to polytheisms or India's continual need for reform. In this way, with the creation of the progressive, a hegemony comes into being, a class that shapes and decides values. Monotheism had, for instance, been adhered to by Muslim rulers, but the monotheistic beliefs of the political dispensation didn't engender a hegemony. At some point, Islam suddenly became a resource alongside the Upanishads and Unitarianism for Ram Mohan's monotheism in the early 1800s. The liberal hegemony in India emerges around this time, also the time as it happens of the growing colonial dominance of the East India Company, and is never subsequently, this hegemony, coterminous or synonymous with the political dispensation in power in the country, except maybe in the 50 years of the so-called Nehruvian epoch. So this hegemony comes into being when the crown is, in power. the first half of the 19th century is also when the liberal Indian seems to start to identify themselves as citizen rather than subject. The tone of the early to mid 19th century liberal is not of the subject but of the progressive. A transition of power is being made at this time not only from the local and pan-Indian aristocracies to the East India Company and then in 1858 to the Crown, but from those aristocracies and their worlds of rulers and subjects and disparate religious universes to the moral ethos of the liberal Indian proto-citizen. Even with the advent of formalized British rule under the Crown, this class remains the hegemony. A hegemony constituted of citizens rather than subjects or, for that matter, political rulers. These are citizens partly in Sartre's sense, without institutions, army or police. The British themselves never form a hegemony in India. They are apparatchiks of empire, the custodians of institutions, army and police. At worst, they are, in Sartre's vocabulary, oppressors. At best, they enter the peripheries of the hegemony through friendships with figures in that liberal history. Even what we think of Western literature and culture comes to us more, I think, through the mediation of this hegemony than merely by dissemination through the colonial apparatus of education. But the liberal hegemony is not merely a make-believe or secret citizenry, because it does, with the founding of the Hindu College in Calcutta in 1817, begin to enter, then shape institutions. And I have in mind figures like exaggerated and sometimes tragic figures who are tragicomic, comic and tragic, like Henry Louis Vivian de Rosio and Michael Madhusudhan Dotto, and their eccentricity marks them out as also people who partake of that play that I was talking about earlier. Okay, now summarize time, and then move on to maybe. So now another movement happens, and this is roughly 100 years after the Crown, after the East India Company kind of consolidates itself. The Battle of Plassey is lost. So as the power shifts to the Crown around 1857 to 1858, the so-called mutiny is suppressed. There is polarization between colonials, the British, and between them and Indians. The Ilbert Bill is a crucial amendment, doesn't come through. Indian magistrates in the 1880s are not allowed to try Englishmen. The other kind of constellation of factors which then increase the polarization. In this polarization, a domain of invisibility and modernity converge in the kind of world that the Indians live in, and this world, the fact that it's invisible. I mean, as I've said this in other contexts, I say it here. One thing you can do is go to Kipling's stories to kind of. Kipling knows about this world, but he won't talk about it. So his stories have, as you know, they have characters like Kim, and they have the talking animals. The talking animals are a kind of sign that something playful is happening, but he won't talk about that play in terms of modernity. He must create a different continuum, Kipling. So I'm speaking about Kipling because his dates are, they coincide with the beginning of this domain of invisibility that happens post the shift to the Crown. So alongside Kipling, in 1860, you have the night owl, Hutam Pachar Naksha, the night owl's capers or sketches, written by Kaliprashanna Shingo, published, and that is a modernist text, one of the first modernist texts, also kind of foreshadowing Rambo. It's a kind of prose poem about the city of Calcutta, where language becomes the kind of subject and character as much as Calcutta does, and we move from the representation of human character and human history as being the kind of main subject of a prose work with that text. And then you have Michael Madhusudhan's kind of rewriting of an episode from the Ramayana, in which he, via William Blake's kind of observation about Milton, that that he was more of the devil's party without knowing it, and it was only when he wrote about Satan that he was truly unfettered or unshackled. It builds on that insight to create a rewriting of an episode of the Ramayana in which Ram's adversary's son becomes the tragic protagonist. So the shift is also connected to ideas of unfetterment or unshacklement of freedom. But we don't know about this because it is invisible. It's a domain, it's a teeming domain, it exists, and it gradually begins to have its own audience, its own critical and creative traditions, but on another level, it remains a form of play that, except for those engaging in it, is unknown or is invisible. And this invisibility allows it to be playful and free. Now, there's one other thing that I want to speak about here and then come to the stories by Premchand. And this is the shift in the meaning of texts to writers at this time, post 1858 onwards, right up to Tagore in the 1880s, 1890s, the shift for them in the way they understand the potential for them of the Upanishads and the Gita. So the Upanishads and the Gita for them no longer remain texts that, as was the case with, say, Tagore's father or Tagore's father's friend Ram Mohan Roy, a kind of receptacle for a monotheistic God. They move towards, say, the Upanishads for another reason, and this reason has to do with their increasing idea or the increasing lack of belief in a unitary self. So what begins to emerge at this time with these writers like Tagore also is a critique of the unitary self. So if Shibnath Shastri, who's a contemporary of Tagore, and before him, Ram Mohan Roy, invested in some way in the idea of both God and the self that emerged as this God, as this one God emerged, a self emerged, and this was the modern self that was, unlike a community that believes in a range of gods. This is the modern self that is articulating itself vis-a-vis in relationship to God, to one God. And this unitary self becomes then the progressive self, the modern self, the self that kind of is throwing off the shackles of superstition, polytheism, and moving forward and thinking in a different way. And this self becomes foundational. With Tagore, you find this self breaking down and this self, this unitary self beginning to be subjected to scrutiny as being too impeding, too constraining. And again, the kind of critique of the self, the unitary self, the reformist self, the progressive self, the citizen self, happens through these instances of play. So let me just read out a bit where I speak about this happening. I mean, I've just kind of given you a summary of the background of this shift, which happens post 1858, I think. So what then of the unitary self of the Enlightenment? Or the self of, in Shibnath Shastri's word, the Nabojagaron or new awakening? Tagore's poetry, given his exposure to Buddhism and the Upanishads, starts dismantling it. So here's a quote from the Upanishads. There are, of its many kind of propositions to do with the unitary self not being a useful idea. So here's one. There are two birds, two sweet friends who dwell on the self-same branch, says the Mundaka Upanishad. The one eats the fruit thereof and the other looks on in silence. Or Tattvam Asi, you are that, Uddalak Chandogya Upanishad. If Uddalak means I am Brahman, then I, the cherished I of human consciousness, of the Enlightenment, the progenitor of liberal knowledge, cannot be I. Tagore presumably has this in mind when inviting his friend Priyanath Sen to his wedding in 1883, and I quote from his letter to his friend. Priya Babu, on the auspicious day of the coming Sunday of 24th Agrayan, that is November-December, my close relative Sriman Rabindranath Thakur will be married at an auspicious hour. We would be grateful if you could join us on that occasion in the evening at number 6 Jorashako at Debendranath Thakur's house to participate in the wedding celebrations. Yours sincerely, Sri Rabindranath Thakur. In 1941, Tagore resurrects this odd syntax when describing in a letter to the poet Buddhadev Bose what he calls the inaugural moments of my poetical career, and refers to the sense of transfiguration he had in Jorashako as a boy when he saw a cow licking a donkey. Quote, in the entire history of that day, it was Rabindranath alone who witnessed the scene with enchanted eyes. No one else was instructed by the history of that day in the profound significance of the sight as was Rabindranath. End quote. Tagore wrote this 2 weeks before his death, expressing a difference of opinion with Bose about what one might call the liberal hegemony's privileging of history, that is, the idea of development from past to present. Quote, I have heard it said again and again that we are guided altogether by history. I have settled this debate in my own heart where I am nothing but a poet. I find it difficult to put up with the pedantic historian. I have it in mind to say, off with your history. Dur hogge tomar itihash. End quote. In the course of the letter, Tagore evokes Buddhism and the Upanishads, but our eyes naturally glaze over these acknowledgements on a first reading. We miss their capacity as formative and subversive conceptual resources as we miss the irony of their chameleon-like transformation, their key role in the creation of liberal modernity, monotheism, and later, in the 19th century, their part in modernism's critique of that liberal modernity. And this is happening. The Upanishads as a resource, the Gita as a resource are, I mean, they're everywhere. So here, I mean, I obviously I don't have time to go into Arnold's kind of engagement with the Gita and how his thinking changes through it. But just this one quotation from Rambo. I want to be a poet, and he's writing to a letter to a friend. I want to be a poet, and I'm working to make myself a seer. You will not understand this, and I don't know how to explain it to you. It is a question of reaching the unknown by the derangement of all the senses. The sufferings are enormous, but one has to be strong to be born a poet, and I know I'm a poet. This is not at all my fault. It is wrong to say I think. One ought to say people think of me. Pardon the pun, I is someone else. Now, this is a famous quotation, we know it. We like to, it comes up again. I won't quote this other bit where he again returns to this formulation. We tend to kind of place it as we do this kind of this fracturing of the self in a kind of trauma, and the trauma of modernity and the trauma of the West losing its kind of the unitary nature of its inheritance, its culture. We need to place it as a kind of liberatory moment where new kind of conceptual frameworks are making possible these departures. And the conceptual frameworks are coming from these sources which Tagore is looking into, which Rimbaud is looking into. And these are, say, the Upanishads. But the Upanishads are placed then in three places. And I hope I'm not veering too much into this kind of, into this discussion to do with the Upanishads. But the three places are the one which we know, all of us know, the Orient. The second place, it's history in humanism. Whether it's what Raymond Schwab says about the Upanishads and their translation, or what Warren Hastings says about the Gita being a Unitarian text, or finally the founding of the Brahmo Samaj and a kind of selfhood being created in the shadow of one God. And then the third, over here, the actual kind of slippery nature of Brahman and the self that is contained in these texts, which is then making it possible to explore a form of consciousness that goes beyond an expression of selfhood. So in Tagore's 1894 essay, we find, for instance, the first time the articulation of the idea of stream of consciousness, which has been sort of, the idea and the terms have been arrived at by William James kind of 2 or 3 years prior to this essay. Tagore is talking about it in an essay on children's nursery rhymes, which he writes in 1894. And in this essay on children's nursery rhymes, he brings in this phrase, Nitto Probahito Chetonar Majhe, in the constant flow of our consciousness, in the constant flow of consciousness. And he uses it to critique the more unitary forms of consciousness, which he over here characterizes or describes as the adult mind, or the linear kind of movement of a particular form of thought. So this is what he's saying. When one starts to think objectively with a specific objective in view, one's intellect and imagination take on an integrated purpose and begin to flow in a single direction. The substance one calls one's mind is so authoritarian that when it awakens and emerges into the light of day, the greater part of the world within and outside us is obscured under its influence. Think about it, the call of birds in the sky, the sough of leaves, the babble of waters, the hubbub of human habitations, so many thousands of sounds, big and small, rising without end, so many waves and tremors, comings and goings, yet only a small fraction of all this impinges on one's consciousness. This is chiefly because one's mind, like a fisherman, casts a net of integration and accepts only what it can gather at a single haul. Everything else eludes it. It has the power to move all irrelevancies far away from the path of its set purpose. So here, the idea of irrelevancies and the superfluous, or anabashak, that which is not necessary, is set against the movement, onward movement of the authoritarian mind, which filters everything out that is superfluous or unnecessary. So for Tagore in this essay, what he's saying is that the children's rhymes make room for or accommodate random associations and superfluous or irrelevant images, lines, progressions, which the more adult mind filters out. So in the Bengali children's nursery rhymes, he finds a particular flow of consciousness, a daily flow of consciousness, which will not filter out the superfluous, and which then he sets up as in a critical relationship with this authoritarian adult mind. And here he is actually, again, he is turning away from the reformist self of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the reformist self of his forebears, into proposing a different way of thinking about the self and thinking about the mind. And is turning away from, not completely turning away from, but because he does embrace reform to a certain extent, but he will not give it centrality, especially in the creative process, that reformist worldview. He wants it to break down. So what happens then for Tagore is that, and for that invisible modernity of the Indian languages, is that hegemony, the citizenly hegemony, becomes the target. It's not a nationalist literature. It's the colonizer is not the target. The more immediate hegemony of the liberal, the progressive, is the target. It's that which breaks down in this particular sphere of freedom. Okay, now finally to the stories by Premchand, in light of what I've said. A few months ago, I discussed a couple of stories by Premchand with my students, Shatranj Ke Khiladi, or the chess players, from 1924, and Bade Bhai Sahab, older brother, from 10 years later. Premchand, as most of us know, wrote in both Hindi and Urdu. Hindi by morning, Urdu by afternoon, he claimed. For me, these stories felt remarkable as I reread them, for being situated in the history I've just outlined, for the interface in them between the progressive worldview and the anti-hegemonic impulse. Premchand was, of course, a leading light of the progressive writers movement, Writers Association. Even if we weren't aware of this fact, we'd still associate him, from our memories of stories encountered in school, with a literature of activist ideals, of socialist reform, of socialist realism, reform, and resolute excoriations towards betterment. This is what we thought Premchand was about in school, which is why we want to avoid him, basically, reading him. So anyway, one of my students, Shah Faisal Mushtaq, drew the class's attention in his essay to Premchand's speech in Urdu at the inaugural meeting of the All India Progressive Writers Association in Lucknow on 9th to 10th April 1936. Discovering it inflected his reading of Shatranj Ke Khiladi. Premchand argued in his speech in 1936 that classical Urdu writing and poetry were passive, fantastical, and non-realistic. He wanted literature to reflect and represent reality. Quote, literature contains a narrative of the real expressed through a concrete and pure language. That is, Faisal points out, the language of the masses. Literature is best defined as a critique to do with reality in the form of dialogue, short stories, or poetry. Art needs to benefit people, says Premchand. He values art based on its utility. Adib ya artist taban aur khalak katan tarakki pasand hota hai. I will not try my Urdu on you, but in Faisal's translation, a writer or an artist is progressive in their essence. If they aren't, they are not artists. They work to eliminate the harmful elements of society so that the world becomes a better place. End quote. Although Premchand reprimands the Urdu poets of the past for their lack of socialist collectivism and for their individualism, infiradiyat, or what he sees as their romantic self-absorption, his own progressive position arises from a reformist self in India which, just over a century after its emergence, speaks with quasi-authoritarian conviction at the Progressive Writers Association meeting. In the chess players, this tone is mimicked in the opening paragraphs, a tone echoing the impatience of Indian nationalist historians with their country's self-divided past as well as imperial histories on India's fatal decadence in the last years of Mughal rule. When we read the sentences closely, though, we find their structure is aphoristic. Here are the first two. A quote, "It was the era of Wajid Ali Shah. Lucknow was plunged deep in luxurious living." Lucknow was plunged deep in what? The structure and phrasing lead us to expect misery or torment. But luxurious living, plunged deep in, immediately our inner ear pricks up. There's something off register here. Quote, while one might arrange parties for dancing and singing, another would find enjoyment only in the drowsy ecstasy of opium. The narrator continues. And a bit later, revisiting the structure of the second sentence, he says that, quote, bureaucrats were steeped in gross sensuality, poets in describing lovers and the sufferings of separation, artisans in creating intricate patterns of gold and silver thread, end quote. A picture begins to form, made up of disparate moments that have no real equivalence or relation with each other except through this poetic yoking together of detail and superfluities. Quote, from king to beggar, we were all swept with the same antic spirit, to the point where when beggars were given money, they spent it not on bread, but opium or madak. By playing chess, cards, or ganjifa, the wits were sharpened, the process of thought was developed, one became accustomed to solving complex problems. Arguments of this sort were presented with great vehemence, end quote. It's as if the narrator were only pretending to give us the reasons behind Lucknow's downfall. The story is set in Lucknow. His real intention is to recover an antique history of being. The Premchand addressing the Progressive Writers Association couldn't have accounted for this aphoristic self. It undermines and transforms the progressive, somewhat paternalistic rhetoric. I find I recorded two observations on how aphorisms are arrived at in my notebook after rereading Shatranj Ke Khiladi. The first one, to give an untenable sentence validity through elegance and casual assertiveness. And the second one, to give an absurd statement the structure of an insight and or to give a genuine insight an air of absurdity. End quote. This was my response upon reading those first two paragraphs, which at first glance is spoken in the same voice as the person who addressed the Progressive Writers Association. The story is about two chess enthusiasts, Mirza Sajjad Ali and Mir Roshan Ali, quote, masters of hereditary estates with no worry about their income, who as a result could, quote, lounge around at home enjoying their idleness. Now I'm going to only talk about Shatranj Ke Khiladi. I'm going to skip Bade Bhai Sahab because we've run out of time. They spent their time sharpening their wits, that is playing chess, quite unaware of when it was noon or afternoon or evening. With Mir Sajjad, in whose house the games took place, leaving his family exasperated and helpless. One day Mir Sajjad's Begum has a headache, his wife has a headache, and sends word through a maid to her husband to go out and get her medicine. Quote, Mirza ji was immersed in a very interesting game, says the narrator. Badi dilchasp bazi. She's not on her deathbed, is she? He replies, rephrasing Shakespeare's she should have died hereafter, and adding, can't she be just a little patient? This eventually leads to a bitter altercation between husband and wife, and the friends have to change the venue for future games to Mir Roshan Ali's house. But for some unknown reason, quote, for some unknown reason, Mir Sahib's Begum considered it most fitting for her husband to stay far away from home. This is the other couple. Still, Mir Sahib's drawing room becomes a site where, quote, newer strategies were devised, new defenses organized, and even new battle formations planned, end quote. The Begum's own game is that she's having an affair. Her lover, pretending to be a soldier in the royal army and part of a contingent that's seeking out Mir Roshan Ali, manages to scare off the chess players. A new venue is required. Quote, from the next day, on, the two friends would set out from the house at the crack of dawn, carrying with them a rather small carpet and a box of prepared pan, and go to the other side of the Gomti river to an old ruined mosque which had probably been built in the time of Nawab Asafadullah. Apart from check and checkmate, not another word came out of their mouths. No yogi could have been more profoundly plunged in trance. Meantime, adds the narrator, the political situation in the country was becoming desperate. The East India Company's armies were advancing on Lucknow, end quote. The game continues by the mosque, accompanied by repartee and historic inversions. Quote, Mir Sahib said, "The British army is coming, God save us." Mirza said, "Let them come, but now get out of check." And, end quote. And later, after Wajid Ali Shah is captured, quote, "First save your own king, then you can mourn for his majesty." End quote. In the end, the friends end up attacking and mortally wounding each other after mutual allegations of cheating. The game ends, so do their lives, so does the story. Quote, "Silence spread over all the broken archways of the ruins, the crumbling walls, and the dusty minarets looked down upon the corpses and mourned." End quote. One game leads to another. I mean, Premchand's story, written when Hindi literature was no more in the sights of empire than Mirza Sajid Ali and Mir Roshan Ali were, nor the empire any more at the core of this world than it is in Premchand's tale. The story is set in 1856. The deposing of Wajid Ali Shah leads to the mutiny and the transfer of power to the crown. The forms of play in the story are self-reflexive invocations of forms of play to come. Premchand's story is in its own way a form of play which takes on the persona of the post-Ram Mohan progressive nationalist reformist and enacts not so much the demise of the Mughal Empire as the sly unraveling of the progressive self. Chess absorbs the chess players. Other things absorb their wives, and absorption, oblivious to the world and yet preternaturally attuned to it, absorbs the author and reader. Literature's play comprises the cherishing of the dilchaspi for stasis. The stasis is what is introduced by this text, Gita. This idea of the potential of stasis within narrative. With the players, quote, quite unaware of when it was noon or afternoon or evening, end quote. And it involves arguing for stasis and absorption being modes of energy and action while mocking that dilchaspi through the narrative voice. This dilchaspi might be, you could say it's another word for savoring, for you know, this, the savoring of ras, the pleasure that we've been talking about. This absorption is at once bad and good, true and untrue, and it's this confusion of binaries that makes the story freeing and delighting. That is why we don't mourn while reading Shatranj Ke Khiladi, we laugh, as we do with Kafka's stories, and feel invigorated. The conceptual shift behind the texts that lie in the history of this immersion is hinted at very quickly here. Quote, "No yogi could have been more profoundly plunged in trance," end quote. A reminder that the Gita, the Upanishads, and Buddhist thinking transform in modernism nothingness, for Hegel, identical to the Gita's pointless nihilism, stasis and non-linearity into positive rather than negative categories. Premchand's word in the original for David Rubin's trance, the translator's word trance, is samadhi. And I composed that brief history of cultural circulation above, mainly so that we may get a sense of the kind of literary thought this word represents, as well as its conceptual position in the story. Premchand in Shatranj Ki Khiladi undoes the self that will later address the Progressive Writers Association. At the PWA, he speaks as a citizen of a nation. But when Mirza Sajid says, "First save your own king, then you can mourn for his majesty," yet another republic, or according to the story's historical moment, kingdom comes into being, a domain of play where we are either, as with the case of Lucknow in 1856, losing, quote, our institutions, police or army, or choosing to be without them. In Premchand's story, the moment of defeat is the moment of freedom. So I'm ending here. The only thing to say here is then that we must place this particular history, whether it's happening here in India or elsewhere, in other trajectories, and take them out of also to attend to why they are so invigorating, even when the subject matter is so depressing. Why they make us laugh. Even Kafka, as I said, makes us laugh, even while they are in a more reductive and prevalent interpretation so bleak, is because they are they have been catalyzed by non-representational liberatory traditions, which the 1700s, the 1800s, and the 20th century are a time of exposure to those traditions, and this catalyzing creates a kind of fragmentary, non-linear forms of thought and narrative that are buoyant, that are liberated. We do them an injustice when we say that it was fragmented because Western society fragmented. That doesn't account for the fact why this fragmenting is liberating, is so buoyant. And I would place, therefore, to understand the momentum of these narratives and the changes taking place within them in another history of cultural interaction, which is bringing a fresh set of possibilities through other conceptual parameters into play. Well, that's it really. I mean, I'm not reading the stuff about the other story. I've told you what I wanted to. Yeah. Thank you for your patience. If there's no time for questions, I'm happy to sort of. Okay. Yeah.
Forgive me, this is a bit hard for me to articulate because I'm not so versed in these subjects, but I was also at your concert, and it was the first lecture I've ever heard on the Rag. I'll try to read some about it. But,
on the day of the concert, you mean?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I was at the concert itself before you began to sing.
Yeah.
But I was struck tonight with what seemed to me a congruence, your explanation for a way of understanding what a rag is, and your remarks early on this evening about play. And I wondered if that's something you might be able to just comment on a bit. It seemed like in both cases you were celebrating to some degree, or at least noting an opening of space of a very particular sort for something that could otherwise be somewhat endangered in other traditions. Does that make any sense? I mean, it was very clearly said.
Certainly, there's a connection between ways in which I'm thinking about the rag, what I've been thinking in the last 10 years about the Gita, Upanishads, what I've been thinking about the modern and modernism, and some of the stuff that I've said here, and play as well. It's not possible to kind of speak about at this point about the connections in detail. All I can do is maybe give you 2 or 3 instances of the ways in which I've been thinking. That connects these things. Because I do see that I do see that these musical traditions, literary traditions, philosophical traditions, all I see them as interventions in the way in our default modes of thinking. as I said about the rag the other day, I saw it as an intervention in our way of thinking about music as comprised of modes or scales and constituting songs and melody. So as I said, the rag comes into being at a certain moment when somebody is inquiring into what melody might be if it's slowed down radically, and what kind of relationships of notes could then be uncovered and then meditated upon and elaborated upon. So those melodies which are doing the rounds and which are in the air, each one of them has actually a characteristic progression and clusters and interrelationships of notes. Only when you slow down the melody do you not only see those progressions if you want to, but can also kind of meditate on those progressions, which are different progressions from another melody, maybe with the same notes. So once you begin to do that, that means you're also going beyond not only melody, but also thinking of notes as, when you think of progression in a set of notes, the idea that it just goes from up to down, and that's the way we think of it, the scale or the mode. You're also moving away from that. To move away from that, as the people who come up with the idea or the form of thinking that the rag is, to move away from that, they are making an intervention. So I kind of speculate upon a pre-rag world where you have songs, and where you have modes, and where you have melodies, and where you have the scale, you have the linear scale. And as I say, Bharat, besides mentioning rags, also mentions the linear scale. Sa re ga ma pa dha ni sa, do re mi fa sol la ti do. 2nd century BC, as I said, it's maybe one of, if not the earliest recording or record of this linear scale in music, it's the 7-note scale. So then what does the rag represent? The rag is not continuous with these. It is at an angle to these. It's an intervention, which means that there's no point in talking about antique texts or texts from antiquity as givens, as tradition, if also antiquity already has a sense of lateness and is just the latest kind of intervention in a series of conversations which we no longer have access to, except the fact that we know that the mode must have existed then, the scale must have existed then, song definitely did. So that means tradition always is immediate because it is late. It kind of, a part of tradition is anomalous because it has, when it appeared as an afterthought to what was thought to be traditional at the time, or canonical at the time. And it is right to think of modes and scales as canonical. But the rag is not canonical. It can never be canonical. And therefore, to think of our classical inheritance as a canon is inadequate because it has, parts of it have a quality of lateness. There's an argument going on over there. I would say the same about the Gita or Upanishads. They are part of a conversation. What they're conversing with, we may not know, but they are. You can see them. They're referring. This is not the way to think. This is what they adore over here. But they're not giving you another god in place of some other god. They're giving you a new way of thinking about these things. So I call, to kind of distance myself from the current sociological way of talking about, let's say, a text like the Gita as being, say, Brahminical. I call the Gita alt-Brahminical. that means the word Brahminical anyway has come into existence in the way it has only in the last 10 or 15 years. So Brahmin has been there, the word Brahminical. It doesn't make sense of the Gita's lateness and its anomalousness. And therefore I cannot look at the Gita as being a canonical text. I look upon it as being an anomalous text. For me then, the kind of conversations that I'm talking about are also really conversations which kind of inform your understanding of which kind of modernity is at work in what interests you. And over here, I have again kind of looked at a conversation between a more canonical sense of self in modernity and another more playful kind of breakdown. The playful breakdown. So that's an oxymoron, isn't it? Breakdown and playful in the way we often use the word breakdown now. It again goes to the kind of the double register of these these conversations and what emerges from the conversations. I'll give you one more example. I know I'm taking a long time over your question, but it's just to kind of dwell on some of the things that I've been talking about. So then that means I look upon it. So the chronology doesn't interest me. What existed, what happened in the 1st century, or in the such and such century BC. What interests me is, are these late moments? Are these moments of angularity? And what also interests me is the default position, which I'm calling the canonical position, which they diverge from or depart from. As it happens, that the default position is the position that is closest to us, and we forget it therefore. What I mean by this is that we forget, for instance, that Woolf's essay, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, emerges as a riposte to something else that Bennet wrote. We don't anymore read, unless we're real scholars of that kind of area or those writers, we don't read the Bennet essay anymore. Similarly, we don't read Middleton Murray to explain what it is that Eliot is responding to. Why don't we read them? Because they are us. Middleton Murray, Bennet, those are the default positions. In a sense, they are us. We become them again and again. Woolf and Eliot in those essays are the not us. They surprise us, therefore. They are not canonical. This, I suppose, connects the rag to. That's not canonical either. I'm trying to articulate a different sense of what we usually call tradition and the canonical as a kind of position held vis-a-vis an interlocutor. The interlocutor is always us. Okay, so if there's anything else. Yeah.
I had the feeling, but I want to ask you if this is what you mean or not, that like what fascinated me in your talk is this like reorganizing contrast. So Premchand is a modernist because he's actually also opposing the progressive, but that doesn't make him traditional or conservative.
No.
It makes him another kind of
Modern.
progressive and modern.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I thought this is where freedom appears, because like being a progressive is a kind of a norm already. So you are like a progressive vis-a-vis traditional or conservative. And this binary construction, they are already established in our heads.
Yeah.
So I had the feeling that what you were doing was actually reorganizing the contrast between these categories, and that therefore then the modernity and the freedom reappears because it doesn't play within established borders. Is that what you were?
Yes, and I think that relates to what I was saying earlier as well. Yes, completely. I'm not going to amplify on that because I agree with you, and you have sort of described it well, and it also, yeah, I've been talking about that.
I think we should thank you.